I'm Ijaz Nabi. I'm director of the IGC program in Pakistan. I also head CDPR, and I do a bunch of other stuff, but that's not relevant right now. It is my pleasure to introduce today's session. It's an important one on the KP's ability to raise more taxes. And we have today a very fine presentation. I had opportunity to look at it on the sales tax on services. And the report summarizes what the issues are concerning the service tax, which is a complex tax in Pakistan, because when it was conceived, services were supposed to be, haircutting salons and restaurants. But now we have modern services such as financial services, we have telephone services, etc. And that sort of takes it to a very different area of expertise, which I'm not surprised that our provincial governments are finding tough to deal with. In most countries, such services are taxed centrally because these are provided by large corporations that have uniform standards across countries. But we are where we are, and I think the report very nicely addresses that issue. But I won't say too much more about the report. I'll let the author speak for himself. We have a number of very fine people on the panel to discuss the report. Let me quickly introduce them. We have Hassan Khyber, who's the team leader of the Sustainable Energy and Economic Development Program in KP. This is a UK government-funded program. He will introduce SEED. We then have Mr. Faisal Rashid, who's a consultant with the Oxford Policy Management Group. He is the author of the report, and he will present it. Then we have Mr. Hassan Daud Butt, who has very kindly agreed to provide comments on the report despite not being well. We wish him speedy recovery, and we look forward to hearing from him. And then we have Mr. Jhagra, who doesn't need any introduction. He has numerous achievements to his credit. Above all, he's the current finance minister of KP. So with that, let me proceed. And I think, according to the program, we have Mr. Hassan Khyber saying a few words. So Hassan, do you want to start off?
Thank you, Dr. Sab. I welcome you all to this launch ceremony, which is virtual, considering the pandemic and the situation. I wish we could have been together in the same room. This policy note, let me give you a bit of background. This is sponsored by Sustainable Energy and Economic Development Program, which is a UK government FCDO-funded program, and we are working across a number of areas. It's a £37.5 million program, out of which about £15 million is for technical assistance to Government of KP. And under the program, we are working across a broad range of interventions. But one area where we are working very closely with the Government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is to create more fiscal space, which has become all the more important because in Pakistan, provinces traditionally have been relying more on federal transfers. And in the last few years, there has been this realization that provinces need to generate more own source revenue, more domestic resources, and sales tax on services is one of the most important in major heads. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has done wonders. And if you look at last year, there has been a 64% increase in the collection in sales tax on revenues, on services. And that is despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. So government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is already doing a wonderful job. And we also think that other provinces have also done a great job. There's a great deal of learning that the province can benefit from. So, with that thought in mind, we commissioned this research paper that was co authored by Anjum Naseem Saab and Faisal Rashid Saab, who jointly wrote this paper. And this paper is not an end in itself. This is supposed to lay the foundation for future reform work for Government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And we are working very closely along with other FCDO funded programs with KPRA, with Finance Department, with the Finance Minister in pushing this reform agenda. And apart from seed, there is a subnational governance program. It is also helping the government in this area. So I think UK aid has been instrumental in kind of pushing this area of reform. So with that, I'll leave you to the presentation by Faisal and back to Dr. Saab. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I had two versions of the program. One version is says that Mr. Jhagra will speak at the end, and the other version says that Mr. Jhagra will be speaking now. As if Mr. Jhagra has joined us, we will give him the choice, whether he wants to speak now or later, or both now and later.
Dr. Saab, I think Jhagra Saab will be joining a few minutes late, so I think we can start.
Okay. I have on my screen it says Mr. Jhagra twice, so one of those occasions he will be there himself. If not, let's proceed with presentation of the report. Please, Faisal Saab, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Saab and Hassan. Let me share my slides. Let me know when you can see these slides, please. Can you see this, Hassan sir?
We can see your slides.
All right. So as already introduced by Dr. Ijaz Nabi and Hassan Khyber Saab, I think this is sales tax on services. This is no secret that this is the most important provincial tax. The numbers speak for themselves. This tax contributes 56% of the provincial tax revenue in Pakistan. It's also a fact that in 2010-11, which here has been written as FY11 in short, the collection was being done by FBR on behalf of all the provinces. And at that time, provinces received a transfer of 66 billion rupees on account of sales expenses. So this was equivalent to about 0.36% of GDP. Later on, as was decided by the National Finance Commission in 2001, provincial governments started to establish their own provincial revenue authorities and boards. And by 2015, all of the provinces had established their own revenue authorities in Pakistan. So by 17 and 18, this tax was contributing about 224 billion rupees, which was equivalent to 0.67% of GDP. So you can really see that in terms of tax to GDP ratio, this was doubling of revenue. So this was something quite significant, and the provinces had done a good job, and that is what it seemed. So this was the upside of provincialization of the tax collection. However, there was also a downside, and we can see that, there was a kind of a fragmentation of the value-added taxation system in Pakistan as a result of provincial tax collection. And that manifested itself in, multiple tax rates that were imposed by the provincial governments. There were even sort of differences in the principles of taxation. So one province argues for the origin principle, and the other argues for the destination principle of taxation. Input adjustment, because of involvement of 5 revenue collection authorities, became difficult, and that has started to result in higher transaction costs for businesses in Pakistan. And that is kind of the source of inefficiencies as a result of this initiative of governments in Pakistan. So that's the kind of context in which this paper has been initiated. So I think this is a very important tax. It is very important for provinces, but it is also causing increase in the cost of doing. So here are the main objectives of the study. So the objective of this policy note was to review the current system of sales tax on services in KPRA and other provinces, or the provincial revenue authorities, with primary focus on Punjab Revenue Authority. And we are aiming to identify lessons for improvements in KPRA. So basically that was the objective of this policy note. And in terms of some of the further background, we also had a similar webinar a few months ago in which Dr. Michael Best presented some of the international best practices and literature review findings of those findings. And here they are on the, this is the crux of his presentation. So basically, sales tax on services are complex tax, and there is a very clear incentive for businesses to basically report their transactions, business to business transactions, to the tax collection authorities. And the reason is that without doing that, they cannot basically claim their tax credits. So they cannot claim input tax adjustments unless they actually report their B2B transactions to the tax authorities. However, in case of individuals, the situation is very different. They do not have, because they are the final consumers, they cannot claim any input adjustment. So basically they have no incentive to demand that final tax is reported to tax authorities. And that is kind of the problem in services taxation in Pakistan and around the world. So basically, there is a need to create incentives for consumers to generate a trail of their transaction. And that is why many governments come up with systems which provide, offer lotteries, tax rebates, and other incentives to taxpayers to basically report their transactions to revenue authorities. Similarly, many governments have resorted to introduction of withholding taxation. So wherever you see the money, you should tax it. That is an important principle in the modern taxation of sales tax. Similarly, innovative solutions have been developed. So IT is being used very widely because this tax involves filing of a large number of tax returns every month. And there are so many transactions that are involved. So without the introduction of technology, it cannot be collected effectively and efficiently. So KPRA, I think Hassan also mentioned that it has made very good progress, and that is visible on this slide. So the number of taxpayers who are registered with KPRA has gone up from 323 when the authority was created to about 8,000. Similarly, in 2014, the collection was only 6 billion, which had increased to 17 billion in the last financial year, which was 2019 and 20. A lot of improvements in HR capacity have taken place, and I think visibly KPRA has started to use improvements in tax collection, and that is I think exemplified by the introduction of an SMS portal, decision support system, which helps the management of the field staff. And they have also come up with their own version of a restaurant invoice monitoring system, which is going on, which has been implemented in some of the other provinces for a number of years. So I think with this background, I would like to start by saying that KPRA has done really well. However, I think there are some challenges still there on the policy and administrative side, which need to be resolved to make sure that the tax actually lives up to its potential.
Faisal,
and I think in this regard, the biggest problem in Pakistan is kind of the fragmentation.
One quick clarification. You mentioned somewhere in the report that there are about 90 services that are being taxed. Is it possible to identify which service is contributing how much? Hello?
Faisal, I think you're good.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So, sir, the accounting system does not show us collection by services, but the FBR and the revenue authorities, they actually record every transaction against the services. So possible for them to identify or show collection by services. So it is available with all the authorities in Pakistan.
Because that would be very useful, and we can discuss it later during discussion time.
Dr. I can just interject for a minute. So we did look at some of the data for KPRA, and if I remember correctly, it's telecom and banking probably are the largest contributors in sales and services. And interestingly, and that's the reason for another conversation with KPRA, that right now, when you look at the distribution, we seem to think that the enforcement dividends could multiply the revenues, because much of the revenues are coming from contributors who are already there, like from large corporates, as you said in the beginning. But that's like a quick answer.
You see, the thing is that I mean, what we all need in all provinces and at the federal level also is additional tax revenue. This may simply be shifting the tax revenue from the federal to the province. It may not be any additionality. It is additional to the province, yes, but in the overall tax system, it may simply be a shifting of collection rather than additional revenue mobilization. But we can visit these issues later.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think we'll definitely have more discussion about these things in the Q&A section. And I think in terms of policy, one important area is that although provinces are taxing much bigger number of services right now compared to when it was being taxed by the FBR, however, there are still a large number of services which are outside the tax net. And by adding them, a lot of potential can be realized. And similarly, there are many services which are being undertaxed. So they are not really paying the kind of revenues that they should be paying. On the administrative side, why is this ineffective or a suboptimal situation? The problem is that IT is not being very effectively used. Their provinces are starting to use IT, but a lot needs to be done. Similarly, I think the general problem of taxation in Pakistan, that there is inadequate documentation, and then there are organizational weaknesses in the authority. I think these are kind of the major challenges being faced by the KPRA as well. So in terms of the areas of improvement that have been mentioned in the policy note, I think one important area is tax-based broadening. Many services, as I said, still outside the scope of tax, and provincial authorities are already thinking and trying to move towards a negative. So a negative list would mean that rather than adding new services to the scope of the tax every year, every service would be declared as taxable, and only the services which are declared as exempt, they would be exempt. All other services would be within the scope of the tax. And that would avoid a lot of hassle of bringing new services into the tax net through the Finance Act every year. And more importantly, I think that will help remove anomalies and interpretational disputes, which cause a lot of litigation in our taxation system. Because the service providers argue that the service that is taxable under a particular law, I'm not really providing that service. My category of service is slightly different, and that's why I am not subject to that tax. So all those disputes and litigation can be avoided if we move to a negative list of services. And that is the way goods are being taxed in Pakistan in any case. Area, I think, which kind of was hinted by Dr. Ijaz Nabi, is the identifying the tax gap. So I think it's really important that we sort of see the contribution of all these services in the revenue collected by KPRA and the other provincial authorities. If there are services which are not being taxed properly, we can actually develop a plan. We can focus on them, improve their compliance, and increase revenue yield from these services. So I think this type of studies, one of them was done in Punjab, and that identified a 70% tax gap in Punjab. Some of that has been plugged in the last 2-3 years, and I am sure a lot of relevant work has been done in KP after a study in 2015 when they tried the potential from taxable services. But I think it would be really nice if they actually do a study which sort of undertakes the review of the potential from all services. And that will really tie in very nicely with the idea of introduction of the negative list, because then we'll find out where there is greater potential and we can focus our efforts to collect revenue from that service or the group of services. Organizational capacity of KPRA, I think this authority was created in the Directorate of Excise and Taxation, and it basically inherited the kind of organizational structure that was prevalent in the directorate. And that basically meant that there was a concentration of different functions within a single position. So one officer was in charge of assessment, as enforcement and compliance, and sometimes audit as well. So I think that really is not the way a tax authority should be run. I think government has realized that, and they have therefore moved this authority into the finance department under the finance minister's own sort of surveillance, and that will help them actually organize this authority better. And it is recommended in the policy note that a thorough functional review of the authority should be undertaken. And in the light of that, the authority should be organized on functional lines. And that would mean that they would be able to sort of develop their own professional tax services, which would be focusing different specializations. And that is how an authority should be run. And I think capacity building has also been indicated as an important area, because right now there are capacity issues. People working in the authority do not kind of training that they should have to work in the authority. So I think in that regard, the authority can review the option of creating their own training academy, or they can use the existing academic institutions for capacity building of their staff. In any case, use of effective and efficient use of information technology could be very useful for KPRA, because these days IT is being used for tax-based broadening. Another objective is to establish a real-time connectivity with businesses, performance management of staff, dispute resolution through use of IT in a more sort of in a faster manner, improved inter-agency coordination, and tax compliance. And some of these examples are here highlighted in the boxes. I think the most exciting idea to me is the use of data scraping. So what is data scraping? This is basically use of IT to search to identify new taxpayers. These days, in the times of COVID, in which the authorities were required to undertake surveys to identify taxpayers, new taxpayers who were not within the scope of their tax collection on their tax registry. Now this job is easier. You can
Is it only me who cannot hear, or?
I think he's connecting again. He got disconnected.
Okay, he's back on.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. So I was talking about data scraping. So I think data scraping could be really useful in helping the authority sort of
Do you want to do it without the video? No, you can't because you have to show us your slides.
Dr. Nabi, he's disconnected.
Oh.
Yeah, I think we'll have to maybe give him a couple of minutes. So internets could be, yes, he's back.
Terribly sorry about the internet. I hope I can be back now.
Ji, Faisal, you may try switching off your video if you can.
Sure,
That might
I'll
help.
do that.
And
Yes.
the last time you started, I think you were still on an earlier slide. So maybe you can go back to the slide you were on.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Uh, Hassan, I'm sorry, I cannot see my slides right now. Can you tell me which
He-
slide are you seeing so that I can start from there?
So do see, yes. So I now see the bringing an IT for improved compliance. Now I
Okay.
can see that actually.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So I think I was talking about data scraping. I think that can be used to identify new taxpayers very easily because the information about taxpayers is now easily available on internet. In the times of COVID, I think that's really useful. In Punjab, for example, this was tried, and in a day or so, the authority was able to identify more than 2,000 new restaurants and add them to their tax base. Similar thing can be done here in KPRA as well. Integration of public sector databases is another very interesting initiative where information can be used to effectively tax the service providers. For example, there are a number of there is PESI, there is Excise Department. They have a lot of information about the service providers. Through that, new taxpayers can be identified. And then the use of third-party data can also be done to check whether they are complying with the tax properly or not. A restaurant invoice monitoring system, I think this is quite famous. So through this, a real-time monitoring of collection and invoicing by restaurants can be done. And then in Punjab, a lottery scheme was also introduced to create incentive for people to report their invoices or send their invoices to the authority. And that led to a reported increase of 28% in revenue. A similar initiative is being taken in PRA for courier and hotel services. E-courts have been established as well. Similarly, there is a system of e-strive. E-strive basically helps the authorities, settle their input adjustments against each other and make the system more efficient and coordinated. Similarly, PRA has systems for effective monitoring the performance of their staff, and they call it PRA Mirror and PRA I. I think a little more on the e-courts because e-courts are helping the authority provide, helping resolve the disputes of the taxpayers vis-a-vis the authority, and the matters of appellate tribunal and commissioner appeals. They are using this forum for online filing of appeals, notices, cases list is made available online, hearing is done, and the decisions are also made available online. So this is a bit on the IT. IT can also be used for mass compliance. And an example has been that in Punjab, an audit compliance unit has been set up, and they have developed a risk criteria to review tax returns. And that criteria is sort of applied on all tax returns filed by the taxpayers. And if there are any anomalies, the tax returns can be then thoroughly verified, and further information can be sought from taxpayers. And that really has helped in identifying short payment of taxes and at times tax evasion by the taxpayers. So that's a very good use of IT as well. Apart from that, I think the taxpayer communication is really important. That's an area highlighted in the policy note, because according to many experts, the lack of information or lack of awareness is one of the major reasons of non-compliance by the small taxpayers. So taxpayer awareness campaigns have helped in Punjab and other authorities to help increase the tax compliance. So I think a similar effort could be done in KPRA. They are working on it, but it can be made more effective by effective messaging for taxpayers. But I think, as many would agree, harmonization of sales taxation in Pakistan and having a semblance of integration into our system is really, really important, because it is very difficult for businesses to operate in this situation. And for that, we have to sort of undertake to bring in political consensus. At least the provincial governments can have their own platform through which they can provide an opportunity to businesses to file a joint return that can help all the authorities. They can collect their own revenues, but the return would be only one. And that would also help settle their sort of input adjustment disputes as well. So National Single Window Initiative has been launched by the federal government, and that is under implementation at the initial stages. That should be pursued. Otherwise, if there are problems, the provincial authorities should definitely try to work out on their own integrated system in Pakistan. Finally, I think this is the final slide. I think this note basically provides you some of the important lessons that can be used by KPRA. A logical step would be to develop a tax reform strategy through exploring further on some of these areas and setting up of a donor coordination forum, because as Hassan pointed out, there are a number of donors apart from FCDO like GIZ and some of the others, World Bank and USAID, who are also interested in supporting KPRA. So an action plan should be developed and responsibilities should be divided among the donors, and that would, I think, provide a lot of dividends to KPRA for future reforms. I think I'll stop here. I've taken more than allotted time, but that was the required thing, I think. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Faisal. This was excellent. I looked at your report, and you have summarized it exceptionally well. We have you pointed out the potential, and you pointed out the solutions to achieving the potential. I think that's more respect for policy note of this kind. Fortunately, we've got good examples from within the country on this that you have out. So implementing the next step, we know it, and rolling out the reform should be relatively easy. Now we have I request Mr. Hassan Daud Saab to his comment on the report. Thank you very much for joining. I know you are not feeling well. Wish you recovery, and very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, sir. I will be a bit low on my voice because my throat is still choked up. So, with this said, I've just had to what Faisal has said in the last 2 days. I was able to get sufficient time to read the policy document. I think the document is well crafted. the important aspect of capacity building, incorporating IT technologies, new ideas is some of the features of this report. I would just like to briefly explain what is happening in and around KP as a neutral person, because I joined from federal government, and what I observed was that the leadership, both political and administrative leadership within KP, are extremely pragmatic. Extremely pragmatic in a sense that they understand that this is a watershed moment for them. They've done enough hard work in the last 7 years in transforming their province, integrating it into a one unit, and bringing novelty within the overall framework. While working as within bureaucracy, novelty is not so encouraged. But now things are changing. New technologies are being embraced. New ideas are being embraced. I've seen that we have done mapping in shortest possible time. We are working into deregulation in shortest possible time. And Taimur Jhagra Sahab has been the champion of ease of doing business and bringing in tax reforms. The overall surge in collection of 64%, and then new taxpayers about 51%, is a great indicator of the effort that is being. And this is not him only. I think he has a strong team. CM Saab is also supporting him, and bureaucracy, finance secretary, ACS, chief secretary, and secretary industries and nodes like us are actually being part of their team. What is so encouraging to see is KPRA is now working on building their capacity, and Taimur Saab is actually managing the change management very well. Because I understand that bringing change is not so easy, especially in the overall framework of governance that we have. So the work done by SEED, UKAID, Faisal Saab, yourself, I think this will be a good stepping stone in order to take the right kind of steps. The overall environment in KP is changing. We understand CPEC is coming, CAPEC is coming, and this watershed moment cannot be lost. And I think this pragmatism of the political leadership is helping us at an operational level to take bold steps, bring novelty in our ideas, and then create the kind of ease of doing business which is much required. I've seen KPRA being now forthcoming in helping people to adjust, bringing the change management. And change management is not just KPRA. The customers also are, embracing this change. They are accepting the kind of help that is being forthcoming. We're setting up portals now. Within KP Business Portal, we have 17 line departments actually online. We have actually transformed the local government's initiative, and now as we speak, more and more changes are coming in terms of embracing technology. But it is always a caution, optimism in what we are doing. There is risk of being over optimistic. So I think the pace will continue. We will embrace this change. And I think the work that is being done by you will help us, navigate better through this process. So thank you very much. And I won't speak more because the champion of all this is here now. So let's hear him to what he says.
Hassan Saab, thank you also for participating today, despite not feeling well. We really appreciate that. Jhagra Saab, welcome. It's great to have you with us as always. Faisal has already presented the report. Maybe I can ask Faisal to give us a 5 minutes.
Sure. I think, by the way, I read the report. So I think it would be useful if you want to summarize both the report, but also the discussion, if you like, in 5 minutes. And then I can happy to close if that is something that helps. I think I'm quite keen to also know how the discussion went and what is emerging as insight over here.
Right. So the discussion hasn't. Faisal made his presentation, and then Mr. Hassan Daud gave his remarks, and you had arrived by then. Basically, Mr. Hassan welcomed the report and said that it would be very useful. He highly valued your leadership in transforming the revenue system of KP, which is fantastic. We had a bit of an exchange on the report very early on, in which I had observed that whereas this is fantastic for the province, that revenues have gone up by taxation of services, but when we look at the structure of services that are being taxed, it turns out that the bulk of the revenue is coming from IT and perhaps financial services related. Now, this I said in the overall scheme of the fiscal effort that we need to make as a country, this is simply shifting revenue collection from the federal to the provincial government. I think there's still an advantage in that, because the provincial government in capacity to collect revenue, which is fantastic, because that's been a weak side of our federal structure. But in additional news, and then Faisal pointed out that his report actually talks about the need for doing the tax gap analysis, because that will point out what additional services can be brought into the net so that we can actually have net additional revenue mobilization as opposed to a shifting of tax collection. So that we had a little bit of discussion on that. Since you are here, I would like to push forward my own hobby horse in this. I've seen on several occasions in the past when we've become very close to reforming, for example, in Punjab, the property tax system, and then suddenly manna from heaven arrived in the shape of the constitutional amendment, so that provinces started to get much more revenue, and the whole property tax reform was just thrown out of the window. So what I would like to suggest is that we really use this opportunity. Just because we are getting additional revenues from taxing services, not identifying new taxpayers, but just collecting the tax on services which would have been collected anyway. I think we should not lose sight of the fact that there is still a lot of work to be done on property tax reform, because I think for the provinces that has to be the golden goose. For the last 30, 40 years, no sector has added so much value as the property sector. And no sector has required public services like the property sector, because new sectors open up, they want all kinds of services, all kinds of infrastructure. And yet we are capturing a tiny fraction of what we should be capturing in the property tax. So it's fantastic that tax on services is available to the provinces, but we should not lose sight of the fact that we need to identify new services, additional services that should be taxed, and B, that we should really continue to focus on the revenue base that already exists, and property tax is one such base. So that's my hobby horse. I have pushed it in your direction. It'd be great to get your comments, by way of conclusion or by way of suggesting new thoughts that can be discussed.
Look, I think that this is indeed a extremely important topic. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and it's paradoxically, it's strange to say that someone should be passionate about taxes as a topic because, by the way, yesterday I was filling in my tax returns, and it's painful, tedious, and also a sad process to see some money go from your pocket. But it's something that we must all contribute to, right? So whereas no one likes to give tax, I think countries are run on the revenue that they build. And Dr. Saab, as you said, I'll just start off by picking on a statement that, highlighting rather than picking on a statement that you talked about, which is about solving the fiscal challenge that we have, right? And I think this is indeed the right time to start triggering the right discussion on it, because it feels too often, and I talk here as a provincial rather than a party representative, it feels too often that in terms of solving the fiscal challenge, we are constantly trying to basically shift revenues from one federating unit to the other, right? We've closeted the solution space to a point where the federal government, which indeed has grave structural revenue challenges and has had so for a while, institutionally seems to think that the answer is a flip of the NFC award, which I personally don't agree with at all. And between provinces, when we actually talk of the NFC discussions, based on what I heard in the last attempted NFC, typically you have 4 provinces and the federal government saying that we're very poor, we need more money, right? And surely the answer has to be, as a country, if everyone doesn't have enough money, and it's true, I think and many of the people here will know better than anyone else, that while the provinces run roughly balanced budgets, right, in a way the provinces are forced to, and if you look at the 2 biggest areas where the provinces should be spending, i.e. health and education, and you look at the country's GDP spend on health and education, you will very quickly see that we spend about half of what we should be spending on health and education. Our spend on health is about 200 billion. Our spend on education is about similar. So effectively, that means there's 400 to 500 billion that I'm not spending in terms of quality teachers, doctors, facilities, operationalizing, and there are true problems there, right? I've recently analyzed the budgets of many of our secondary hospitals, and whereas the salary budget, which is actually in the context of a hospital quite important because it means technical manpower, can be between 500 and 700 million, the non-salary budget is less than a tenth of that, about 50 million, 80% of which tends to be medicine. So basically you're left with 10 to 15 million to run a hospital for a year, with which you can effectively, I guess, install a few new fans and clean up the place twice a year. If you think of road maintenance, if you think of the irrigation sector, if you think of many other sectors where we should be spending more in terms of service delivery, we actually end up making the compromises that we don't need to make. If you think of a sustainable way of funding the pension challenge that we have, right? Because we're eating that out of the budget, we'll actually make a case that provincial budgets should ideally be twice of what they are right now. But I obviously can't get that from a federal budget which already faces a primary deficit of sorts. So what is the answer? The answer is indeed that we need to work on revenue generation in a progressive manner, in the right manner, and perhaps we need to get out of our traditional molds and try and work together. I think there is another part of the answer, which is about significantly cutting the cost of public spending in government and other entities. And again, I know that the party in the past or individuals have had a different stance on this. But I'm personally very glad about the privatization of Pakistan steel mills, of the action to be taken in PIA. Because remember, we're never talking about the jobs of 5 or 10 individuals. We're talking about public money and where that is best served. So I think it is really important that we start to work, all stakeholders, and I think there's a ton of work that we can do over here in terms of how the revenue base of the country can be increased progressively, fairly, sustainably, but certainly increased, because a 10% tax to GDP ain't gonna cut it if we want growth in Pakistan north of 5 or 6%. And then we've also got to work on the cost of government. In terms of the discussion on KPRA, sales tax on services, and I'll touch UIPT. And we've had this conversation before. I welcome the report. I endorse the suggestions that it's made. And I'll tell you, we've worked on some of them, would welcome help on areas like tax gap analysis, but there's other areas where we're already working. So for example, corporatizing the structure to make it more of a standalone organization. Over the last week, I looked at both the KPRA proposal for that and also studied the Sindh and Punjab, Sindh Revenue Board and Punjab Revenue Authority Acts to see what we can best do, and I hope to do that in this year. I can tell you that though this isn't the beginning of our reform journey, and my personal experience working in the private and development sectors, reforming KPRA and getting results out of it was one of the first things that I personally invested time in after assuming office in this government. And happy to say that over the last 2 years, revenue at KPRA essentially at least have doubled. Last year, we got about a 65% increase. Revenue went from just over 10 billion to north of 17 billion, so close to 70%. And this year, we are currently on a run rate to hit at least 20 billion, despite the COVID economic suppression. At the moment, we're actually on a greater run rate than that. There's a 60% increase. So we finish somewhere between 20 and 25 billion, depending on how the next 6 months pan out. And for a small province like KP, where there isn't been historically a tax-paying structure, I think that is important both from the consumer side as well as from the organization side, because I think one of the biggest things that we've done is actually invigorate the organization. They're actually going after the money that they need to collect in the right manner while trying to make life simpler for businesses, as opposed to just turning up to do a job and going back home. And I think that's a huge cultural shift. How has this happened? I talked about this before. It's consistency in leadership. We've deliberately and clearly ensured that whoever is in charge stays there. We've added resources from outside to provide the technical help that we need. We have an advisor who used to head the Punjab Revenue Authority. We've got people seconded from FBR, good people who are seconded, who are now part of that top team over there that does a good job. And we've started ever since the first month I've been here looking at results, because ultimately it's the results that count. And what I saw was the first time that we started to look at results, the organization started to transform in terms of looking at how it can achieve those results. So obviously the first areas that they look at are the ones that for them are the low-hanging fruit or the quick wins. So they start pushing to resolve unresolved issues such as reconciliation with the FBR, which wouldn't happen, resolving the telco case on services that were stuck, doing better audits, analyzing their data better. So a lot of things, building up their team, putting in place an appellate tribunal so that cases that are stuck unnecessarily preventing revenue from being collected don't stay stuck for long. So all of this has happened, and I think that resulted in the growth that we saw last year, which ended us at 17 billion. And if COVID hadn't happened, I'm very confident that we would have touched 20 last year. This year, we continue, and I can tell you that growth has come from three main sources. First, there's the dividend of the improved telco collection. Second, we have a number of smaller taxes. And third, they're also responsible for collecting an infrastructure development cess that wasn't properly collected previously, but that by doing a little bit of thinking, increasing the number of points that it's collected at, is going to show growth of about 1 billion over this year, from about 200 odd million or 300 odd million collected all of last year, to I believe about 1.2, 1.3 billion. So basically, when I talk of the 20 billion figure, it's about 1 to 1.5 billion from telco, 1 billion from the IDC, 500 million from other services. And remember that there's depressions as well. The restaurant business isn't doing as good. The hotel business isn't doing as good. And in many cases, we've actually reduced tax rates simply to basically incentivize registration. Because as you rightly pointed out, the potential is significantly greater than what we have. However, for the potential to be realized, we have to basically create a tax-paying culture where revenue as a concept doesn't have a bad name. And I believe we're taking big steps towards doing that, right? Because I think to make any of these major reform steps work, you have to actually think outside of the silo in which we normally think of solutions. I'll give you two examples. With KPRA, we are both, it's not a coincidence that we're able to introduce this universal health coverage insurance program with the confidence that we do, because for me, the additional money is the additionality in collection that I'm getting from KPRA. We're also experimenting with trying to bring the hospitality sector on board. We know that much of the hospitality sector, while they are encumbered with 7 or 8 Mickey Mouse kind of taxes that we've removed some of and are happy to remove the others. But they tend to think of sales tax on services as something that consumers will resist. And what we're trying to push is to say that if you register and help get us on board in places like Kagan, Naran, Natyagali, and so forth, we'll ensure that the money collected from the hospitality sector is invested in the infrastructure improvement of the areas. So this sort of circularity, I believe, is going to significantly increase business confidence and consumer confidence in terms of tax paying, as well as making the process easier, less bureaucratic, because we have to make it halal or kosher or whatever you want to call it for people to start paying tax and realize that that is what the country is run on. The last thing I do want to say, and I'm happy to share this analysis later on, I do think that what we have done is not trivial. And I think that it is equally important. What I would like to see is that by the time that 2023 is around, that we touch at least 30 billion in revenue. annual revenue. And ideally, I'd like to have a figure north of 35 billion. I do think that is possible. It depends a little bit on overall economic conditions and how dynamic we can be. But think of that, that is all top-up revenue for the province that has huge significance. But remember that this is actually possible because we have an incentive to collect it. And I have done some basic comparison. What is interesting is, while we do say that the provincial taxes collected are only a drop in the ocean, I have a slightly different theory about this. If you were to hand over FBR in the respective provinces to the provinces and hand over the sales tax on services regime with its current resources to the federal government and just completely swap tax accountability, but along with it, the organizations, while maintaining where the money is going, I don't think you'd see any difference in tax collection results, right? Because whether people are paying tax on services, whether retailers are collecting sales tax on goods, whether people are paying income tax or not, is a function of the social culture that we have on tax, as opposed to just the appetite of the provinces or the federal government. And I think if we think out of the box, because the numbers that I've got from RTO, Peshawar and Aptabad, the two FBR offices in KP, I think that our growth actually compares significantly favorably with what's happened with FBR collection in KP. And I also have a theory for that. If you have a large centralized organization, where do you think the FBR leadership and machinery is really going to focus? It's going to focus where the bulk of the money is, in Punjab, in Karachi. But which means that a lot of the, if you like, the next level economic centers of the country aren't going to come under the microscope in the same way for the institution that's trying to, increase the revenue generation of the province. Whereas if you look at, for us, KPRA is responsible for roughly about 50% of the revenue collection of the province, if you discount the money that we make through energy payments from the federal government. So 20 to 25 billion that we collect will be out of a total revenue base of 45 to 50 billion for the province. And so I do think that it is important, and that's again what I want to end with is, we're in a hurry to increase our revenue base indeed. It is going to be through reform. Dr. Ijaz Nabi, I think you're right, that similarly UIPT has a big role to play. It's up 40% this year with some changes that we've made. I think again, the potential for reform is significantly greater, and I'd love to know where you reached in Punjab pre-18th Amendment. But I think again, the one flaw that we're trying to fix with UIPT is the money again sort of went into a black hole, and even though it was then passed on to the municipal authorities, it was passed on in a way that the impact of it isn't visible to the residents of the areas that are actually giving it. So we're trying to actually restructure that, how the money is spent, where it's spent, and in some areas it was actually not given to the areas from where it was collected, right? So for example, Hayatabad being the premier town in not just in Peshawar, but in KP, pays about a third of the UIPT of the province, but that money was actually not spent in Hayatabad, which defeats the purpose, right, of that collection. And we have to make those circularities to actually get people to understand why paying tax is important. So I'm proud of the journey that we have traversed over the last couple of years, but under no illusion that we have a long, long way ahead. And we do it for the province, but we also do it to change the cultural mindset of the country towards what it means to collect revenue and how we have to do that. And I think that is a joint effort, and that's where I think your help is so important, is that as long as we think in our specific silos, right, we may be able to solve a small problem for us, but it won't be big enough to actually fund the sort of gaps that we actually need to fund, for which we need to make a concerted effort with the federal government on what we need to do and how the tax base and the tax collection culture in the country needs to improve. And I can commit to all of you that in this case, KP Khyber Pakhtunkhwa will be at the forefront in trying to be as dynamic as possible for the rest of this term and hopefully beyond as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jhagra Saab. As expected, you've stated the vision, you've stated the means for achieving the vision, you've stated your track record on achieving the vision, and you have at the same time pointed out how the present report that's being discussed today will help give further traction to what you want to do. You've opened up a number of other areas for discussion, which we certainly can do, but perhaps on another occasion, because I have a number of people want to ask questions, and let's give them the opportunity, and then maybe towards the end we can take up some of the things that you raised. We have a question from Mr. Khatak, Mr. Zara Khatak, President, Industrial Association, Peshawar. He says, our main source of revenue should come from transporters. KPRA should educate our transporters how they can claim input sales tax on fuel and spare parts they use. So that's one question, and he has a secondary comment on the report. Let me read that out too. He says, back to back B2B cannot claim discounted sales tax rate as KPRA's latest policies. This is against the basic essence of value-added taxation. Your presentation clearly stated that B2B have increased their share. That might be the case in PRA, which is the Punjab Revenue Authority, and not KPRA. So those are his two, there's a comment and then there is a suggestion. It'd be good to get a response on these.
Three things. I think Zarak is probably right on both counts, and happy to work with him. Zarak is part of a number of young industrialists around KP who've been very helpful in this and starting to change this culture. But there's one thing that I do want to say is beyond the 2 points that he made, we indeed need to do the education of the transporters. I think the value of reports like this and sessions like this is it throws out some of the complexities and the problems that we have. But I think the one place where I do believe we haven't done a good enough job is in tax education and communication, right? And I think this is again symptomatic of the sort of things that we do typically around, when we say we're going to run a media campaign or a communication campaign, we tend to tick a box rather than really think of what it will take, right, to change mindset and behavior, which is not a small part. And that is somewhere that we intend to do more, do better. We need much more creative, engaging communication that is part of a longer term plan to consistently hammer and get inside people's minds about how important it is to pay tax and also make transparent to them the impact of the tax money that is collected. I think that is in general a huge gap, not just in KP, but across Pakistan. But it's certainly a gap that I've flagged for a while, and one whereas I'm always happy to talk about areas we've done well, I think it is also important to flag where one could have done better, and this is an area where I think we can still do significantly better.
Fantastic. I think this whole area of communications is extremely important. I can tell you from other contexts. I was very closely associated with the Thai financial crisis back in the late 1990s, and we realized that educating the judges, communicating with the judiciary on what the reform is trying to achieve goes a long way towards removing the legal hurdles to implementing tax reform. Because there will be challenges, whether it's income tax or sales tax, there will be challenges in the courts. But if the courts have already been properly communicated with on what the government is trying to do, especially the angle of equity, because remember, a large part of our erosion of the tax base is because not everybody who should be paying taxes is actually paying taxes. For example, you've got a fraction of people who should be paying the income tax, others are not. So the question is that this is a question of fairness. People who should be paying the tax, they should indeed be in the tax net. So I think if we come at it from the equity angle, the judges look at it much more favorably and clarify try to remove the legal hurdles in implementing tax reform. I have one or two other questions from the audience. We've had very good participation today. So let me go to the audience. There's one which says, it's a question regarding HR. Like many other government departments, tax collection authorities do not have even basic job description and performance appraisal mechanisms for employees. What can be done in this regard?
I can tell you one major step that we have already done. KPRA is perhaps the first entity within the KP government where we have put in place since last year a performance incentive-based pay structure for the entire organization. And we actually took 6 months to come up with it. And I can tell you that, and I'm sure they can tell you, it was one of the hardest discussions because I think the challenge is often that to get these things right, you need to talk at a level of detail that it sets the incentives right. Because too often you can have schemes such as, I heard about FBR in the past. I'm not fully clear of the facts, so excuse me if I get the facts wrong. But quite often, pay incentive structures don't work because they're not well designed. But we actually problem solved over quite a long time a structure that included some revenue target-based incentives, some non-revenue target-based incentives, both of these only being coming into play if a specific minimum revenue growth target is met, and any performance-based incentive pay only being made based on KPRA's performance in a third-party consumer survey of how they feel KPRA is treating taxpayers. Right, so it was actually very well, it was an experiment, well thought out, very successful. And so it's something we are repeating this year. And hopefully, I believe that this is something that all of government should indeed follow. Although I think it will take some time because, again, it is the culture of government administration where we simply don't have incentive-based pay structures at scale enough for them to be easily accepted. So I guess that answers the first bit of your question. The second bit of your question indeed is right. KPRA and a lot of other entities at the moment, both in KP, in the federal government, in other provinces, are a little bit of a mishmash between positions being filled by civil servants, positions being filled from the market, but no clear vision. I believe, and I hope that this is how the final act will show, is that this should be much more of a market-driven organization where civil servants, as well as people from the market, should be able to apply. But one that, at this point, I believe that if we make these authorities or organizations that are actually meant to create more dynamism in government, it isn't important how many of them we create, but it is important that when we create them, that they actually follow the right corporate principles to a T. I know, Dr. Nabi, you head one of these units as a chairman of the board of an organization I've worked with in my past life, the Punjab Skill Development Fund, and I know it does an excellent job. And I think, that's the sort of standard that we ought to be aspiring to. Obviously, the processes in government of creating rules, laws, convincing stakeholders, because all these positions all these decisions get tied to the promotions of civil servants and all. It ends up taking more time than one would like it to. But, my answer is that, again, we're seeing these as zero sum. There's no reason I cannot create senior positions for civil servants to sort of more than satisfy their promotion concerns, right? Outside of entities where people should not just be wanting a position for a civil servant in order for there to be a promotion opportunity, but because a person is best suited and most passionate for that job. That's the culture that we need to create in places like KPRA. And I'd say we're 3/4 of the way there in terms of incentives and less than half of the way there in terms of redoing the organization, which is tied to passing a permanent act for the organization. But inshallah, we will get there. And I think it is important to share each of these success stories because we've got to convince ourselves, the public opinion makers, that a different form of organization, a different form of government can actually produce better results and greater impact.
I think that's a brilliant idea, and thanks for mentioning Punjab Skills Development Fund. It's a challenge, but I think what it shows is that when the government wants to experiment with a new way of delivering a service, it can create the legal environment for it, and it can indeed create the working environment for it. For example, when it was created at the time for a chief executive, decided into of Punjab Skills Development Fund, and that board, we were able to attract excellent people to the board because they knew that their decisions would be respected and they would be implemented in terms of the companies. So there are lessons experiment, and some of those lessons can be applied in regular government departments to improve. But these are all the challenges, and we should do whatever we can to meet those challenges. I'm going to move.
Can I make a small, in your report, you rightly highlighted the requirement to have these young legs and, getting them through the capacity building process. There's a small suggestion I would like to make, that while you're recommending a functional organization, I think for a certain period of time and the amount of work that Taimur Sahab is actually expecting, I think it should remain in a projectized mode. Maybe some of it in functional, and achieve targets based on projects. Otherwise, achieving so much in little time would be difficult. So this is a small, I think, suggestion based on the kind of organization we need.
Thank you. This is
one last question, perhaps.
Yes. So we have a question from. Well, there are two, but I will put them in one, and then you can decide to answer whichever which you want to. One is Varda Malik from Seed asks, how do we strike a fine balance between expanding the tax base on the sales tax on services while also ensuring that the tax structure is rationalized? Relief is provided to business in the current circumstances. The second one is from Ikram Ghani, who asks, has KPRA tried to obtain data of KP taxpayers who have been subjected to tax deductions then according to section 153, 1B for identifying potential taxpayers? He's an ex-member FBR. So these are the two questions, and I leave it to you, Taimur Jhagra Saab, or to Hasan Dawood Saab, or to Faisal to respond to these.
So I can quickly take those. Look, I think the data sharing culture between KPRA and the FBR also is, let me call it less than satisfactory, right? I think both ways. We made one smart move, which has helped us rationalize the tax structure significantly, as we made the Director General of Excise, who looks after some of the taxation, including UIPT and a few other taxes where there's indeed some double taxation with KPRA. Gave him joint charge of KPRA so that the territorialness in terms of reform dissipates, and indeed it is. And Fayaz, who's the MD of KPRA, has done a very good job wearing both hats in rationalizing where taxes did not need to be placed. Look, we found and started working on, but again, I think that we sometimes struggle with the analytical capacity, not just data sharing between FBR and KPRA, because and there is an effort currently to harmonize sales tax on services, to create one return under the auspices of a World Bank project. And again, it's going slower than I would want it to. And I believe it's again going with way too much more territorialness than I would want it to. But territorialness to be expected, right? So to me, for example, the definition of whether something is a sales tax on services or goods, Dr. Azabi, if it is transferring money from one head to the other, from center to province or province to center, is not really a win-win, right? I think what we need to be much more thinking of is where can we actually increase or reduce some of the tax gap, increase collection, reduce some of the tax gap, tap into, as you rightly said, the many people who don't contribute their fair share of tax, right? And I think for that, indeed, the sort of data analytics capacity that we need is not going to be present in the usual structures of government,
yes.
Right? But if we put in the right people, other than FBR, there are other sources of data that are also available, whether that be the chambers of commerce, where there's many entities that register, whether that be scouring the web for online businesses, but all we would really like is to register them and for them to pay a token nominal tax in some places only, whether that be data sharing between the excise authorities and KPRA and vice versa. I think a lot more can be done. We've started to do it, right? But it's a small, lean organization. And I think that as the Act comes in, we will be able to do more because we'll be able to hire or take on the kind of expertise that we don't have access to at the moment.
Absolutely. FBR Policy Board, the focus of discussion was exactly that. How do we use data analytics to actually identify the gap and then identify people who we know from other data sources should be in the tax net. And FBR is also trying to develop expertise of data analytics in that area. You're absolutely right. A lot of the action happens in the provinces, and there are similar data sets available in the provinces. It's a question of getting the right to identify proxies through which we can try to expand the tax base. This has been a discussion. We started talking about the sales tax on services, but of course, this is part of a much, much larger issue. And Taimur Jhagra Sahab, you minced no words in both setting your vision, but also acknowledging the areas that remain challenges that need to be addressed. All the provinces are in the same boat. Punjab may be a little bit ahead in one or two areas, but the size of the middle class. Now, you see, we don't take the old GT road anymore, so we miss a lot of data in the process. But I recently took a drive along GT road from Lahore to Sialkot. I wanted to see the new motorway, and then took the GT road all the way up to Islamabad. And town after town after town has huge wedding halls, has large number of private colleges, and shopping center after shopping center. We now have a large middle class. That middle class has expectations from the government in terms of good governance, has expectations from the government in terms of quality services. That will require revenue mobilization. So I think we need to work with that data, and we need to take the tax revenue to 15% of the GDP over the next few years if we are to respond to what the public clearly wants from the government. So with that, thank you very much for giving us your time. We know you're very busy. Hassan Saab, we wish you the best and hope you for speedy recovery. This has been a great discussion. Faisal, thank you for presenting the report. And Hassan, thank you for facilitating everything. Thank you very much. And of course, to the participants we had about 60 participants at one time, which is fantastic for a discussion of this nature. But we still have about, until recently, we had 35 with us, even at this stage of the discussion, which is fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.